subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. Epictetus opens his handbook with a division, not a lecture. Some things are up to us, our judgments, our choices, our own reactions, and some things are not, our body, our reputation, what other people decide to do. Discipline, in the Stoic sense, starts here, before any habit or routine gets built on top of it. It is the discipline of sorting, correctly and repeatedly, which category a given problem actually belongs to, because most failures of self-control trace back to spending effort on the wrong side of that line, trying to force an outcome that was never within reach, instead of governing the one thing that always was. A student who fails an exam despite real effort has already done the discipline part. Whether the grade reflects it is a separate matter, filed under a different heading entirely. Marcus Aurelius ran this discipline as a daily practice, not a theory he admired from a distance. His notebook, written for no audience but himself, is full of arguments he has with his own reluctance, entries where he catches himself wanting to stay in bed, wanting to avoid a difficult meeting, wanting to feel sorry for himself, and then talks himself back into the work anyway, the way a craftsman keeps returning to a bench he'd rather leave. He compares the human obligation to work the way a bee is obligated to make honey, or a vine to bear grapes, or the sun to keep rising, not as a burden imposed from outside, but as the plain function of the thing itself, something it would be strange to resent. An emperor who ran an empire from a military tent on the Danube frontier still needed to have this exact argument with himself most mornings, which is itself a kind of evidence that the argument never fully resolves for anyone, no matter how much practice they've had at winning it. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, treats discipline the way a trainer treats an untested body, something built in stages, deliberately, not summoned by willpower on demand the moment a crisis calls for it. In one letter he describes setting aside a period each month to live like a poor man on purpose, plain food, rough clothes, sleeping without comfort, so that poverty stops being a private terror and becomes something he has already rehearsed and found survivable. The point wasn't asceticism for its own sake, and Seneca is careful to say so. He isn't recommending permanent hardship, only a scheduled visit to it. It was proof, gathered firsthand rather than assumed, that his comfort didn't own him, that he could lose it and still function, which is a very different kind of confidence than simply hoping he never has to find out under real pressure. Epictetus is blunter about the actual mechanics of building this kind of confidence. He tells his students to practice on small provocations before trusting themselves with large ones, to treat every minor insult, spilled cup, or petty inconvenience as a training rep, the way a wrestler drills a hold against a cooperative partner long before ever using it in a real match against someone trying to beat him. Skip the small representatives, he warns, and the discipline simply won't be there when a real crisis arrives and asks for it under pressure. The untrained response will surface instead, whatever that happens to be. This is the part modern self-help usually leaves out entirely. Stoic discipline was never framed as a single dramatic decision made once and relied upon forever. It was accumulated, deliberately, one chosen minor irritation at a time, on a schedule the student controlled. There's a particular entry in Marcus Aurelius's notebook, usually placed early in his 10th book, where he tells himself to stop debating in the abstract what a good man is supposed to look like, and simply become one, stop rehearsing the definition and start doing the thing the definition describes instead of admiring it from outside. It reads less like formal philosophy and more like a man interrupting his own procrastination mid-sentence, catching himself in the act of substituting analysis for action. That's a useful correction for anyone who has read a great deal about discipline without practicing much of it. At some point the sorting, the rehearsing, and the arguing with yourself has to turn into the actual, boring, repeated action, or none of the reading was worth much. Both men also address what happens after a failure, which is where most self-discipline advice quietly goes silent. Epictetus tells his students not to be discouraged by a single lapse, but to return to the discipline the same day, the way an athlete who stumbles doesn't abandon the sport but gets back into position for the next rep instead of walking off the field. Marcus writes to himself in a similar register after what sound like his own bad days, less self-congratulation, more a brief acknowledgement of the failure followed immediately by a return to the task, without the extended self-punishment a modern reader might expect from a man running an empire under constant pressure. The discipline, in other words, was never about a perfect unbroken record, and neither man pretended otherwise in his own private writing. It was about how quickly a person returned to position after breaking it, and how little ceremony they made of the return. This distinction matters because it changes what a lapse is allowed to mean. In a framework built around an unbroken streak, a single missed day can feel like proof the whole project has failed, which is often exactly the thought that causes someone to abandon a habit for good rather than simply resume it the next morning. Epictetus removes that trapdoor on purpose. A lapse, in his account, is just data, evidence about which provocations still catch a person off guard, useful for choosing the next training rep, not a verdict on their character or their prospects. Seneca makes a related point about his own monthly poverty exercise. Some months it went well, some months the discomfort simply won and he cut the exercise short, and he records both outcomes to Lucilius without much shame attached to either, treating the failed attempt as informative rather than disqualifying. None of the three men treat discipline as something a person either has or doesn't. Epictetus frames it as constant sorting between what's yours to control and what isn't, repeated until it becomes reflexive. Marcus frames it as a daily argument he has to keep winning against his own resistance, never a settled account he gets to close. Seneca frames it as a muscle, trained through deliberate discomfort chosen in advance rather than discomfort that simply happens to you without warning. Put together, their advice amounts to something less inspiring than most self-discipline content promises, and more useful in practice. Expect to have the argument with yourself again tomorrow, expect to lose it occasionally, and show up for it anyway the next morning regardless. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.